Welcome back to MotoringBox. I'm Sean McKellar and today it is a rainy day here in southeast Queensland, so I thought it would be an awesome opportunity to reminisce about cars, to look at the past, the present, but also the future. So let's get straight into it. So I've had a few people in my comments section over the past couple of years asking me from time to time, what does my car history look like? Well, today I'm going to step you through it all the way from my first car through to the cars I have today. You of course know about those later ones, but there are a few earlier ones here which may surprise some of you and some which are to be expected. So back when I got my license, I was 16 or 17 years old, but I didn't actually get my first car until I was about 21. So for those first couple of years, I was driving my parents' cars around the place on my learners and also on my Ps. I learned to drive in a Holden VP Commodore. It was a 1992 executive. That thing was actually a really good car to learn in, I think. It had quite a lot of power. It surprised me. And the other car I learned to drive in was actually a 1987 Suzuki Sierra. It was one of the long wheelbase ones and it had some nice big meaty BF Goodrich tyres on it from memory. And of course it was a manual as well, so I learned to drive manual on that car. And it was only a 1.3 litre engine. It was severely underpowered. But that was a really good car, I think, for learning how to get the most amount of power out of an engine by working the gears when you need to. But when it came time to get my first car, my parents made me get a job. They made me work for the money. They did match me dollar for dollar though on the car. So I started working, I started saving up my money, and I found the car of my dreams, at the time anyway, and within budget of course. So over the years, I developed a love of the Ford LTD. I had a friend back in the 90s whose parents bought an FE LTD, or probably like an 87 or something. But I really loved the luxury of those cars. You know, it was a really simple car, but it rode very well on dirt roads, very well refined, very comfortable, and as it turns out, very cheap when I was on the market for a car. So I was after an FE. But then I saw this one pop up on the market. It was an FD, it was a 1984, the same year that I was born. And as it turns out, this one was actually made on the same month that I was born too, so it just seemed right. So being in 1984, some of you would know that was the year that, well, I think it was 1983 or 82, that Ford actually discontinued the V8. And of course, being that young, I didn't want a V8 anyway, so this thing was a cross-flow straight six, 4.1 litre. I think it was good for about 111 kilowatts back in the day. And I had a ball with this car, you know. I really loved the look of it. And even though at the start I thought it didn't look quite as good as the FE LTD, I actually came to like this one a lot more and appreciated the styling differences over the years. It had about 155,000 kilometers on the clock, and that was back in 2005. So I had a lot of fun in this car. Didn't really do too many modifications to it. I did put a new head unit in it. I think I replaced the speakers as well. But as you can see in the photos here, I also lowered it with petted suspension. I didn't do that myself because I was still a beginner with cars back then. So I paid Petters, I think it was about $2,000 all up to lower that car back in 2005. And it was the lowest height which they had on offer. So as you can see, it was sitting really well on the road, but you did pay the price for those looks because there was zero suspension travel in the front. The back end was still pretty good, but you really did feel the bumps through the front end, and it's really what set me up with this kind of PTSD thing I have with lowered cars. I can't stand them anymore, and it all stems back to this one. So the looks kind of did make up for the crappy ride to a degree. And later on you'll see I put some, I think you call them centerline wheels. They were 14-inch. Don't remember the width, but the fronts were sort of fairly flat, but the backs had a lot of dish on them. It was probably like at least 10 or 12 centimeters of dish, and I don't know if I would have picked those wheels today, but back then I thought they looked absolutely incredible. I picked those wheels up for about $400 from the Caboolture swap meet, threw some cheap tyres on them, had a ball. That thing was dangerous in the wet though. This thing really taught me a lesson or two or three when it came to oversteer on wet roundabouts. So it would start stepping out at really low speeds and it would give you lots of time to sort of catch it. So if anything, it was a really good sort of training car, I guess, for a young guy like me, 21, 22. So 2005, I bought this. I drove it around for about 2 years and I started getting a little bit sick of the crappy ride, but also the 3-speed gearbox, but also the low power of the engine. So I remember saying to my dad, I want to buy my next car. It needs to be a manual, I want it to be turbocharged, and I want it to be a 6-cylinder. So around 2007, I started looking around the market. So couldn't get an XR6 Turbo, that was still too new. I was looking at, I remember 300ZXs. I was looking at Silvias, even though they were only 4 cylinders, at least some of them were turbocharged. I even went to look at a Toyota AE86. That thing screamed. It was amazing, but it rode too rough. Didn't have aircon. It was kind of not what I was looking for. But then I actually went to have a look at this thing. So this was a 1999 Nissan Skyline R34 sedan. And it was the GT Turbo model. So these things came in non-turbo, but also turbocharged. They came in automatics, which this thing was. And I picked this thing up a little bit over budget. I paid $17,500. So this was in 2007. It had about 65,000 kilometers on the clock. It was a grey imported car, and they all seem to have about the same amount of Ks on it. So whether you can trust that or not is debatable. But this thing, I love this car. It was amazing. You know, even if the kilometers weren't correct, it still felt really brand new. It smelt brand new, and it just drove amazingly. It was chalk and cheese compared to my old LTD. It had a lot of power. It was really smooth. It was really quiet, and it was really comfortable too. It didn't have any rattles, not a single rattle going over bumps. So I was in heaven when I picked this thing up. But it didn't take long for the modification itch to start. So I replaced the head unit. It had some crappy Sony CD thing in there. I replaced it with something better. Seeing as I was still fairly young and foolish, I also put a pod filter, an Apexi pod filter on it. It wasn't in a box. I did actually get like a box or a shroud for it later. But this car, even just putting the filter on it, it sounded amazing. The induction noise, because the turbo is about this far away from the filter, it just screamed. And later on, because I did want to modify the car a bit further, but I couldn't really do it myself, I actually went to Miles and Alan at AM Auto, who you might know as Dose Vader and also Turbo Yoda. Alan, of course, is now doing the Skid Factory on YouTube. I'll link his channel up here in the corner. But they were running out of his garage. And I won't say where it is because it's still the garage that he uses today. But they were running a little business called AM Auto. They specialized in Subarus, but they also did imports as well. So I had them do quite a few bits of maintenance on this car. They replaced the water pump. They did the general servicing for me. There was probably a few other things I don't remember. Coolant flushes, brake flushes, things like that. But I also had them fit a full X-Force exhaust system. It was a fully stainless steel system. And later on, I also had Miles perform a manual conversion on this car. So it was a 5-speed box out of an R33 Turbo Skyline, but everything bolts up. It's the same engine, the same drivetrain. So this car went from being a 4-speed automatic Tiptronic to a 5-speed manual. And in a turbocharged car, a manual is amazing. Just ask me how I know. So I owned this car from 2007 all the way through till probably 2012. But in the meantime, I actually purchased a few other cars too. So I was driving around in my R34 Skyline, loving life, but secretly, down inside me, I was missing that old school Falcon feeling that I'd come to love back in the day. So I found this 1981 Ford XD GL Falcon. It was a 3.3 litre 6 with a 4-speed single rail manual gearbox. And this thing was a real love-hate it kind of car. It was in mint condition. This was probably 2008 I picked this car up. Cost me $3,500 from memory, but overall it was in really good condition. It had just under 100,000 kilometers on the clock, and it was fairly straight. I remember there was a ding in the passenger rear door, and also the front driver's side guard. It was a slightly different color, so it had obviously been replaced and sort of sprayed and not color matched. But have a look at this thing. Have a look at this interior. It was all vinyl, and it was mint. This thing today, even though it's a GL, it'd probably be pushing 20 grand any day of the week. The love was the looks. It was the way it drove, the way it smelt. The hate was the comfort factor, or lack of. So this thing being a GL did not have air conditioning. And living in Queensland, it gets incredibly hot, it gets incredibly humid. And sitting on vinyl is almost like sitting on a hot plate on a hot summer's day. your skin can't breathe, which means you end up almost sliding off the seat with sweat. So it was not a fun car to drive, probably 75% of the year. In winter, it was brilliant, loved it. Heater was amazing. I just loved the smell, the experience, the ambience of driving it. I just couldn't handle it. I went through 2 summers in it. Even though it was sort of my second car, I had the Skyline as well. I just stopped driving it. So I later sold it for about the same amount I paid for it, about $3,500. But the Falcon bug wasn't done with me yet. So I still had my Skyline, and I was always on car sales, and I think car sales was the place to go, maybe Gumtree back then as well, looking for a replacement. And by this time I was starting to miss my old LTD a little bit. So then I found this one. It was another 1984 FD LTD, another 6-cylinder, automatic of course. This one, I think it was just over 100,000 kilometers, 110, 115. And it was in amazing condition. It was a very similar spec to my previous car. It had the blue interior, it was silver on the outside, but it had a sunroof. So I was loving that. It had a little bit less headroom, but it was still enough for me to manage. And look at this thing, you know, I think I paid about $4,000 for this car. This is one of the cars I miss the most from my car ownership period, I guess. Again, these, if you can find them in this condition these days, would probably be 25 to 30 grand any day of the week, even for a 6. Whether or not they sell for that much, I don't know, but whenever they've popped up, they've always been for around that much. As with car bugs, you know, your tastes change, and I sort of had to downsize in the end. We were moving into an apartment, and I think I only kept this car for about a year again, another year. So probably 2010 to 2011 before I sold it. Sold it for about $1,000 more. So $4,500 is what I sold it for. I was stoked. That was the first car I'd actually sold and made money off. I should mention as well, the first LTD I sold, I purchased that for $2,600. I sold it for $1,500 because that thing was rusting terribly. So didn't make money off that car. I didn't make any money off the XD, but I made $1,000 off this. So I was stoked. So that was a very special car. And from here, my wife was needing a car because she wanted to learn how to drive. Now she's actually older than me, but she was a bit late to the party when it comes to driving and learning how to drive. So she said, Sean, find me the smallest car you can. So I took that challenge, literally, and I bought this. It was a Daihatsu Centro, I think it was a 1995, otherwise known as a Daihatsu Myra. And this was the L200. And from memory, it was a 666cc 3-cylinder engine with a 3-speed auto. So she wanted to drive automatic, so I had to find an auto. These are a lot of fun in manual. But you know what? This car was even fun in automatic spec. It was a real screamer. It would really rev out, I don't know to what level because it didn't have a tacho. But this thing would just rev and rev and rev, and it would scream before it sort of slammed you into that next gear. So don't get me wrong, this car was a lot of fun. But again, similar to the vibe of the XD Falcon, this thing didn't have aircon. And I foolishly thought, because it's white, because it's small, surely this thing wouldn't be bad in summer. You know, it's got cloth seats. Surely it wouldn't get that hot, you know? But it did. It got really hot. So much so that it's turned me off cars that do not have air conditioning. Air conditioning in Queensland, you need it. If you don't have it, you're crazy. You're crazy. So this car cost me, I think it was about $2,500, not much. From a dealer in Toowoomba. We drove it home. I lived in Noosa at the time. Yeah, we actually kept that car for quite a few years. We later moved to Brisbane in 2012. We brought it with us, along with my Skyline. They were the two cars that came with us. And we moved into an apartment. So I got a job in the city. It's a very different driving situation compared to Noosa. Noosa, you can sort of cruise around the roundabouts. You don't ever need to stop. A manual gearbox is fine. But in the city, my Skyline was really starting to grate on my nerves. The constant stop-start traffic in the inner city, I just really started hating on that car, big time. Looking back on it, I shouldn't have, but at the time I did. So, the Skyline was the next car to go, unfortunately. I sold that. And I made a loss on that car as well, which is crazy to sort of talk about in today's day and age, because those cars are worth big money now. I paid 17 and a half. I sold that for 12 flat. So it was in pretty good condition when I sold it too. So I don't like to talk about this because it hurts. That car would probably be in the 20s easy today, especially with the condition that car was in too. But let's not talk about that. So why did I sell the Skyline? It's because I'd actually seen a brand new car that I really wanted. I was lusting after it. And you're gonna think I'm crazy, but hear me out, okay? I got a new job in the city. I was feeling fancy and I thought, you know what? I was seeing a lot of people in new cars. It's like, I want to get that new car experience. My parents got a new car a couple of years before and the smell, the feeling was intoxicating. So I wanted that for myself. So I saw this car. It was recently released and the design was stunning. It was a brand I typically wouldn't have considered, a brand I typically wouldn't have even liked. But when I saw them release this thing, I just had to have one. I went to China on a trip. They were all through China as well. And I thought, you know what? When I get back to Australia, I'm gonna go investigate how much these cost and whether I can get one. So it was a 2012 Kia Optima Platinum. Now, to say I drove a Kia is very embarrassing. I paid about 40 grand for it on finance from a dealer, which I do not recommend. But this car, I loved it. I had it from 2012 through to about 2015, 2016. So quite a few years. Even today, when I see these things on the road, I think they look incredible. For a car that's now 10 years old, if you got one of these that's nice and clean, look at it. It's a timeless design. For a four-door sedan, I think they look absolutely incredible. Even better than the Stinger, I reckon. But of course, the Stinger has that amazing driveline. Whereas this thing was not so amazing when it came to under the hood. It was a 2.4 litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder, teamed to a 6-speed torque converter automatic, front-wheel drive. So for a good sort of family cruiser, it was an amazing car. It did ride a little bit stiff. It had 18-inch wheels. The suspension tune was a bit sporty, even though the engine was not, which later got on my nerves a little bit. But I did keep this car, as I mentioned, for quite a few years. I put about 50,000 kilometers on it. Great for around the city, reasonably economical, good on the highway, nice and quiet. It had all the bells and features you'd want. It had a dual sunroof as well, which was amazing for the money. You couldn't get anything like that on any other car for that amount of money back in the day. I was a little bit ashamed that it was a Kia though, so I did a whole badge swap. You could get aftermarket badges that could kind of hid the brand. People would always stare at this thing and wonder, what the hell is this car? They'd pull me up in traffic, they'd be on the horn trying to get me to wind my window down and say, what is that thing? And when I'd tell them it's a Kia, they'd always be like, oh, really? Because this was back when Kia was kind of still not a very cool brand. They've come a long way since then. I think they make some really good cars for families and things like that. But back then they were still sort of transitioning from that old school Kia to this. And that was like a quantum leap, you know? The only reason I sold it is because we were buying a house. We wanted to free up some money, and also the house we were buying, it didn't really fit up the driveway very well because of the low overhangs and the low clearance. So I sold that car for about 24 grand, so made quite a loss. And as it turns out, once you pay the loan off, which again was about 24 grand, I pretty much was done, that was it. So I'd blown something like 50 grand once you include the interest to own this thing for about 4 years. So that is what put me off new car ownership. I really hated the dealership experience and the lack of transparency when it came to what interest rate are you paying, and they really sort of forced me into the deal in a way, in hindsight. That is why I'm probably never going to buy a new car ever again. It's kind of put me off that whole thing. As nice as they are, I do not see the value in it. During that time, we actually got rid of our Daihatsu. I think it was about 2014 we sold it, and we bought another car, which I'm not going to talk about because that's kind of my wife's current car and we drive it around. I don't want people to recognize us, but it is nothing special. It is simply super boring. I may end up showing it if we replace it in the future, which we might. So the Kia Optima was car number 6, was number 7. And that brings us into the cars you are familiar with. So in 2017 or 18, I bought an NC Fairlane. And that's because, well, I'll get into it in another video, but Sort of felt like I needed a project car or an old car again, getting back to that sort of Falcon experience that I used to love back in the day. I'd been out of Falcons at that point for about 7 years, and you thought, you know what, I really want to get one. So that Fairlane was for sale. He wanted 6 grand for it. He started at 10 about 6 months prior, and he was slowly bringing it down before I went and had a look at it. You know all about it. I'll put a video up here in the corner if you want to see more about that car. I ended up paying 5 grand for it, and I quite liked that car. It was an amazing experience. It was a car that I'd always wanted ever since I'd seen one back in the 90s. So to finally own one was an amazing experience. I would have preferred if it was a 6-cylinder, but it was an 8. It sounded good, just a bit thirsty. So I will not talk too much about that car. I've already talked shitloads about it before. So I paid 5 grand for it. I sold it. I won't say for how much, but it was a modest profit. And it's probably not even a profit when you consider the maintenance and the parts and everything I've put on it over the years. Probably didn't make anything off it. So when I owned the Fairlane, I also bought an AU, which you know about too, just for the lols basically. And it turns out later on, I ended up falling in love with it. They are an amazing car for the money. They still are, they're still cheap. For the sort of non-enthusiast models like the Fairmonts or the Fortes or the Futuras, XRs are going up, but they are awesome, solid cars. I've still got it. So I had the Fairmont, I bought a VT Commodore for the channel as well. So from the AU onwards, the cars that I've purchased were kind of for the channel rather than me, which has sort of changed things up a bit. The VT was a good car, it was lowered, struggled with my driveway, it sort of rode a bit rough on the road. So once I'd finished with that, I sold it, bought the BA Falcon XR6 Turbo, which again, it's probably not a car I strictly wanted as such or needed, but I wanted to experience it. I wanted to film a lot of videos with that car as well for the channel. I wanted to do a build on it, which I've done, which isn't quite finished yet. There's some parts here for it, which we'll talk about later. But again, yeah, it wasn't really a car I typically would have gone for. And that's the interesting thing, you know, I'm at a little bit of a crossroads with this car at the moment because, again, it's not really a car I need. And my life has changed since I bought this car as well. Rain's picking up again, I'm terribly sorry. So do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If I had to get rid of one of these cars, which one do you reckon it should be? As much as I would hate to get rid of the BA, because I'm kind of not done with it, it would free up a lot of money to buy other cars and to modify other cars and to enjoy them. Whether it's a Magna, whether it's a Territory, whether it's some kind of Holden or a Toyota, a locally manufactured one. Yeah, I am thinking about things because I want to keep making videos, and this car is kind of reaching the end of its road as to what I wanted to do with it. But now I'm finding that I can't really enjoy it. You know, ever since it was tuned early in the year, I can probably count on one hand the amount of times I've taken this thing out for a drive. I feel really guilty about it because it is an amazing car, but I just don't have the time. But anyway, looking back on my car history, one consistent factor is it's full of Fords. There were a few blips on the radar, but I really love Fords. I've grown up on Fords. My dad had an XP Falcon station wagon. I'd fallen in love with those cars from a young age, and a lot of this stuff that I'm doing today is all for the nostalgia. Because if you look at these cars from a fresh perspective, if you're a young guy in your 20s and your parents never owned a Falcon and you weren't really around for all of the history and the things that come along with it, they're probably not going to mean much to you. But because I was around and a lot of you were around for that period, these cars are just, they're something else, you know? So I guess the thing I want to say to you guys is, I make these videos for you, and I really want to know, what do you think I should do? And what car do you think I should buy next? Because I want to get into it. I've seen a few on Facebook. My next car, I want it to be a rescue sort of effort. I want to buy it for under 2 grand. I want it to be sort of in need of attention, and I want to be able to fix it and send it back out into the world. Sort of like a catch and release. So I've seen a few cars on the market, on Facebook Marketplace, I should say, but I really need to get rid of a car probably before I do that. So do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, I really hope you enjoy this video. I haven't owned a lot of cars over the years, but I do hope to own plenty more in the years ahead. I'm still middle-aged, but I still got a lot of years ahead of me to be tinkering with cars. So do let me know thoughts in the comments below. Have a good one. I'll see you next time.